Aloha Yoga Revealed podcast. This is Alec, vishal, rouben, and I am excited to welcome you back to yet another invigorating episode of the Yoga Revealed podcast. If you have not heard, Yoga Revealed has released its very first offering, the 7-Day Yoga Reset, which is a pay what you can and pay what you want offering that funnels into the 100 Days of Yoga, which is currently on pre-order through the back office and course download in the 7-Day Yoga Reset. You can check it out at yogarevealed.com. Today, I am so excited to introduce to you somebody that was a part of my very first yoga teacher training over 10 years ago. Dave is a Boulder therapeutics massage therapist, anatomy genius, and he has been teaching anatomy within yoga teacher training programs for many, many years. We dive deep into the journey of yoga teachers learning how to not only protect their students, but also students learning to further take care of themselves and what is appropriate for an individual and what is not. Tune into this episode and share it with a fellow yoga teacher if you feel so called to do so. And thank you for following all of us on social media and sharing this episode to your stories and tagging us. Enjoy this episode of the Yoga Revealed podcast. Namaste, Yoga Revealers. Welcome back to another episode of today's podcast, Yoga Revealed. I'm so grateful to be here. My name is Alec, vishal, rouben, and I'm here in beautiful Boulder, Colorado, and I'm sitting across from an old friend who I actually met 10, 11 years ago in my first yoga teacher training. So some of you guys might know I've taken 10 different trainings over the last decade of my life, and that has just had me sit in the seat of svadhyaya, self-study, the studentship. And Dave Abookire, he was the anatomy teacher at my very first training. And a couple weeks ago, I was in the gym sharing my organic superfoods at a booth, and I saw this guy across the way. I was like, he is so familiar. And at the end of the night, I went up and we made the connection and we realized, wow. And we started to talk about yoga and his journey. And I was just like, wow, this is so insightful. And I'm excited to have you here on the podcast today to share your journey as the worker that you are in health and wellness and anatomy and the incredible insight that you have on the body from the lens of yogi. Right. So welcome here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alec. I appreciate it.
Awesome, man.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. One of the first questions that we always like to ask everybody is, how was yoga first revealed to you?
Oh, interesting. Trying to remember how it was first revealed, but I can tell you I remember my first classes. So, yes, I was in Boulder and I took some classes. I'm just forgetting his name now, of course, on camera. Richard Freeman. So with Richard Freeman, So Richard Freeman had a lovely little studio down in Boulder, and I had driven by it a few times, and I thought, that seems like a really wonderful place to learn about my body and to learn how to get into my body, both physically and settled and grounded in my body. So those were my very first yoga classes. I remember my first couple of poses, and in the class they would say, everyone do a forward fold, and my head would be up and I was looking around the room trying to figure out what exactly are they asking me to do. And he would say, I don't know if you've ever taken a class with him, but
a lot.
He'd say things like, have your tail, you're like a peacock, have your tail feathers explore behind you. And I thought, what does that mean? I can have that visual. And so it was really a fun experience of learning about my body, learning about movement, and watching kind of everyone. Usually if you go to a gym or you go to a workout, everyone's doing their own thing. And until more recently, like classes are more popular in the last 10 or 15 years. Back then it was really kind of rare, at least for me in my experiences, to explore everyone moving in the same way at the same time in the same community. It was really kind of a beautiful experience for me.
The Ashtanga Mysore journey. I think that's an awesome way to be exposed, especially with Richard Freeman and Mary Taylor and Ty. They've been on the podcast, I put a lot of time in that room. So that's really cool. And tell us, who are you and what is your authority as a person who knows the body? Give us that journey.
So many, many years ago, I started off in the corporate world and I wanted to get into a line of work that really helped people. And so I found this path. I thought maybe physical therapy, and I was taking classes and just trying to understand how I could access health and healing and find ways to help people. So I studied massage therapy, and I studied orthopedic and injury type of massage therapy back in '99, so many, many years ago, and worked with a lot of physical therapists, chiropractors, trying to understand what do they do, what can I do that supports them, and then what do I do that's differently? So you can look at this synergistic approach of we both maybe have a different way of viewing how to heal a person. And there's things I can do to truly support you. Like you can access something deeper and more like with more depth and more greatness if I help support you, my style of work, not just me. And then there are things that I'm going to be able to do that you don't do, and maybe you can support me in. And so I was always trying to find that path to help people out. So I studied massage therapy. I opened a clinic, and I worked at the Colorado Rapids for 12 years. So I had this wonderful opportunity to see players play, get injured, unfortunately, and then what can I do to bring them back to health? And then once I got them back to health, I started thinking, well, it seems like the things I do to get them back to health are the same things I could do to keep them to avoid injuries. So then we started an injury prevention program, basically, and then if someone was injured, we knew what to do to unwind that. So we had a whole team, a medical staff that worked together.
Wow.
So I did that many, many years ago and kind of worked my way through that process and was invited to teach some anatomy for core power yoga. I think it was in like 2005 or 2006. It was many, many years ago.
The wave was starting.
It was just starting, and they had a program outlined, and I was given the opportunity to totally revamp it, which was great. And then I traveled all around the country with Core Power Yoga and a number of other studios as well locally, just teaching their anatomy programs.
That's amazing.
You know, you were involved
and I was a part of that, yeah. And you know, it's for me, 10 years in now, I might not know as much on an anatomy level of ligaments and maybe bone names, but what I can say through Iyengar Yoga, where I put a lot of my focus over the last 5 years, is that I personally, my strength and my skill set is knowing the rotations and directions that each frame of the specific body part ought to be moving through for the specific individual. And that's been the uniqueness of learning how to teach people, rather than I'm the yoga teacher and I have built this sequence and I'm attached to teaching my sequence despite who's in my class. Right? I think that is something that happens with a sense of more time and energy investment to really learn and know yoga, to know your student. Right?
Absolutely. Well, and that's a lot of my work. I'm a one-on-one therapist, right? So when I walked in to teach these anatomy classes, especially in the early days, I had, we would butt heads a little bit. I would say, remember, I'm coming here to keep yoga safe. I'm not here to just stamp everything everyone's doing. My job is to teach the teachers how to understand what they're teaching, right? And so when you say like that lens I have a lens into biomechanics and movement and anatomy and what is safe for a joint and what is not. So if two people tell you something like, oh, you should do this, that will help your back, maybe I'm the person that says, sometimes that's the case. But in this particular instance with this individual, that doesn't work or that won't work, and here's why. And I think when someone can educate you and give you the why, I hear what you're saying. This is why maybe that won't work for this person, and this should work better, and this is why. You can really make an educated and informed decision on what's going to keep your body safe.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because the masses of yoga teachers, I think with respect and love I share, there's a little bit of dilution. There's a little bit of dilution in what's been learned and what's being taught. From someone like yourself, you have an authority. You know how to keep someone safe. But and when I say that, I mean there's a mass amount of yoga teachers who don't know how to keep their students safe. So what would you say, and the people who are listening who are yoga students, who are yoga teachers, who are like, well, I resonate with this. I want to keep my students safe. I want to keep myself safe. What comes to mind on how you could offer something to somebody who desires that? What would you share
as far as the teachers and students both? So, I'm the why guy, right? Ask questions, ask. So if a teacher says you should do things a certain way, and then, another one says to do it another way. Ask why. Why do you think? And someone else told me this. Oh, that's wrong. Well, why? Why is it wrong? What's right in it and what's not right in it? So for me, I'm always looking at modifications, and like you can call them modifications because based on there's a theme of you're supposed to do things a certain way, but you can also look at it as just treating your body the way it's supposed to be treated. So I have a mild scoliosis. My body rotates a certain way, and so I need to unwind that. So in my poses, sometimes I'm intentionally counterbalancing my spine, which doesn't always look level. So a teacher in theory could correct me, but really, and fair enough, they wouldn't maybe know that about me, but that's something I'm trying to do to correct my own body. So the more you learn about your own body, and again, how to break down the poses. So a big thing I always did with my students, and you may remember this, is I walk through, okay, what pose are we working on? And what's the benefit of that pose? Okay, what are the challenges in that pose? And then what are some other poses you can do that will support, the benefits, right? So let's say you're doing something like, something as simple as a forward fold.
Sure.
Well, for someone, a standing forward fold, maybe that hurts their back, and maybe it's because their hamstrings are tight. Well, we can achieve a smaller forward fold in like a child's pose.
Right.
So how can we back up and find similar benefits without the challenges? And that's obviously a very basic movement. But there are some poses that people are doing. I remember I took a class. It was at like one of those festivals up in the mountains, right? And I think what happens is sometimes people get excited about, let's teach yogis something new. They've done these
flashy transitions.
Exactly. And then all of a sudden, I'm in a class that I feel like I'm in like a gymnastics class, and they're trying to push the limits of everything in my body in an unsafe way, not pushing and challenging, but taking my body to these places that aren't safe. And I thought, why are we doing it? Like, what is this practice all about? Is it about being showy? It's like these yoga competitions. I mean, maybe fair enough, that's for some people, but it's really more about this introspective experience that even though we're all in collaboration in a class, in a community together, we're each exploring our own bodies, right? And so to keep it safe, asking why, understanding what you're doing, and is that serving you and your purpose for practice? Or are you just following what other people are telling you to do?
Yeah. Can we get specific for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
So this might also be an opportunity where I get myself schooled.
Fire away.
So in vinyasa yoga or hatha yoga, not necessarily hatha yoga, but
so
primary, like a flow-based class. When you're in uttanasana, standing forward fold, typically teachers will teach, and it's funny because like I don't teach this because I haven't taught this for 6 years, so I have to try to remember. But in my remembrance, teachers will teach bend your knees and take ragdoll and let the arms fold, and that's what you're taught.
Okay.
And then in Iyengar yoga, it's quite the opposite, where it's about straightening your legs and lifting your kneecaps to the best of your ability. So when you engage the kneecap, correct me if I'm wrong, put myself for the test. As you engage kneecap, it lifts quadricep. Quadricep, it activates, it turns on the hamstrings, which sends a message to our brain to release the intensity in the hamstrings.
The last part's right, the middle part was you fire the quad.
Yes.
It's called reciprocal inhibition.
Okay.
And this is a very simplistic approach, but the quad is the opposing muscle to the hamstring. So the hamstring muscle turns off. It doesn't shut off. It just turns. The nervous system stops the holding. In order for a muscle to contract and move, another muscle has to release. So for my arm to move, I can flex my biceps, but in order for my arm to move, the triceps has to release somewhat, right? It doesn't just completely go limp. So in a forward fold, when you engage, and we call it maybe drawing the kneecap upward, you're engaging the quadriceps muscle, you're releasing the hamstring muscle, and that forward fold allows a release. The interesting thing is when you're in a forward fold, you have an eccentric contraction with the hamstring. So they're releasing, but they're releasing, think of it as like slowly. It's like lowering something from a ceiling down. So they're still engaging, but they're slowly letting you release. And so yes, that system works.
Okay. And so then,
But the bent knee piece is really just, if you have tight hamstrings, it shortens the hamstring. It doesn't put it as taut. And so it allows people who are less flexible to have maybe more access for the forward fold, because it's a hamstring, a little bit of a calf hamstring, and then like the whole low back all the way through the spine.
And so then in Iyengar yoga, what I've heard and seen, people who are not able to straighten their legs because their hamstrings are too tight, they are having the opportunity to put their hands on a block tower to be able to straighten their legs. Where I've heard and learned from different Iyengar teachers, if the knees are bent and you're folding forward fully, slow, long-term train crash to injure the lower back.
Unless the goal is to continually lengthen and strengthen the hamstrings.
I see.
Right. I mean, if we snapshot at that and say that's all you're ever going to do, perhaps I could see that being accurate. But maybe another way to say it is, the question is it better to, instead of bending the knees slightly, staying upright with the knees straight and then getting more of a lengthening of that hamstring? I would have to think about that, but I see benefits in both.
Right. So neither are wrong.
I don't think either are wrong, but I mean, for the long-term gain in a body, I think modifying either way with the intent and the goal to have full length in the hamstrings and full length to the spine would be ideal. And remember, full length doesn't mean keep going. There's a certain point where we don't
want to keep going.
Absolutely.
You don't want to snap.
No. I mean, okay, so let's talk about who usually loves yoga. Like picture a yoga body. They're built a lot like you.
Yes.
Right? This long, lean body, right?
Totally.
And usually, not always, you're very flexible, right? I'm less flexible, right? And so I'm somewhat flexible, but sometimes people are hypermobile. And a large population of people that I see in my practice that practice yoga who are injured are hypermobile. So they move too far. And they're in a practice that is always talking about lengthening, explore, like moving away from midline, as opposed to, I call it coming home. Like sometimes you need to plug back in. We use terms like that oftentimes in yoga. Iyengar might be different than that. Iyengar doesn't always push further. It's about, engaging and holding in proper alignment. But sometimes when we're moving quickly through poses, that flow can sometimes, you're focused more on the flow than on the body position because of timing. And so it's just something to be aware of.
Right. And I remember when we were chatting at the gym, we were speaking about how, one size of yoga does not fit all, right? And there are these different styles that serve different body parts and different body types, rather. And can you speak about that?
Right. So in the medical field, it was always interesting for me. I'd have someone come in and they'd say, "Oh, my doctor said to stop practicing yoga." And I said, "Oh, well, what kind of yoga do you practice?" And they said, "Well, they just said to stop." And I said, "All right, well, let's talk about that." So let's use the example of being hypermobile. So again, for people that don't know what that is, hyper, too much, mobile. So you move too far. Your ligaments are not going to necessarily stop the ball. Let's say in a ball and socket joint, they're not going to stop the ball from moving. So you can move beyond what we call normal or healthy limits. And naturally, it doesn't feel like it's a problem. Down the road, that's that slow death. It can nick away over time, and then all of a sudden you have a problem. So in a situation like that, someone who's hypermobile, I would say that typically be careful in hot classes, be careful in flow classes, especially if they're fast, right? Because those styles of yoga are typically, again, I'm stereotyping here, but typically they're going to push lengthening. And because of the speed and oftentimes the size of the class, there's not going to be as much ability to control where your body ends up.
Individual attention.
Absolutely. Yeah. Where in an Iyengar practice, for example, more often than not, it's more about engaging and holding, which builds strength. And if the instructor is not pushing too much lengthening, you can find that balance point of building strength, because that's what you need when you're hypermobile, is to build balanced strength and not length, because you already have the length, right? And so that's one example of a style of yoga that might benefit someone, where they could still practice, but practice maybe differently than they were. So instead of just throwing a blanket out there and saying yoga's good, yoga's bad, who's the instructor? What is the goal of the practice? What does your body need, and what should you avoid? So looking at that more medically than just yoga fixes everything. Right. And sometimes it's a wonderful gateway into health, oftentimes, but sometimes the practice of yoga becomes a repetitive stress injury situation, and we do too many things incorrectly. And again, I know I'm generalizing. There are so many wonderful teachers and instructors out there with so much education. But again, I would have a very difficult time teaching 10, 20, 40
hard.
students. How do you keep an eye on everyone, right?
You teach a very simple class.
You keep it simple, because how do you, you start doing these like, okay, and now we're going to go up into handstand, all 40 of you, like, whoa. Look out.
Yeah.
I just, I don't envy that. It's a challenge. But in order for students to be safe, I think finding ways to find a practice that suits them and understand what they're doing.
Yeah, it's so profound to me how we change. And as we change, if we're committed to our practice changes with us. Yeah. Our practice evolves us. 10 years ago when I first met you, all I wanted was to teach yoga to everyone. Everyone and everywhere. I was teaching at all the primary studios. At my max, I was at 20 classes a week.
That's a lot.
And I was filling them out. I had 30, 40 people in my class. And the funny thing is, if I took my yoga class then, today, in present consciousnness, I would throw a block at my face. Like, what are you teaching? So fun and so hard, banging music, and it's just like, wow.
Push.
Like
you're in Boulder, right?
Yeah.
Type A classes, I love them.
10 peak poses, right?
Yeah.
And now I teach once a week at Movement Climbing Gym, prop heavy, and that's Tuesday nights at 5 p.m. And last night, sometimes I have 15 people in class, which is a lot. It's a lot to manage. And sometimes there's 5 people in class. And, last night I probably taught maybe 9 poses.
I was going to say how many poses.
Maybe.
And that's, again, just different styles. I don't want to overly advocate one style over another, but there are so many benefits in really sinking in to a pose, understanding it, and doing it correctly. And then holding that correct pose and having those muscles feel it, have that memory.
And one of my favorite things, like one of the poses that I taught was Trikonasana, but we did it twice.
Okay.
And the first side, I gave them a lot of instruction, and we used the block. Some people had to make a block tower. And then we did it again, and as I did it again, I saw some eyes go like, oh God, because it was like, well, I'm like, yeah, I know.
It's going to be sore.
This is the point. And on the second round, I didn't give as much guidance. And I think that's the aim, where I find that a yoga class, and I wonder what your perspective of this is, for the individual, the student, there's a Yoga Sutra where Patanjali says there's 9 types of students. And there's 3 categories. There's the mildly interested student, the intermediately interested student, and then the advanced, the highly excited interested student. And then within each of those subcategories, there's 3 subcategories: mildly mild, moderately mild, intensely mild, and then so on and so on. And my aim in a yoga class at this point in time in my life is to offer a tool to the students that say, hey, maybe there's something here for you to take home. It's not so much for you to just like bliss out for an hour. Yes, it is. And also self-educate and have this be a opportunity to study yoga and take it home. And I find that is something that I don't really see in many other yoga classes. When people come to my class, they're usually like, that was really different. And I'm like, I know. Well,
and also think about what's the off the mat experience, right? So the on the mat experience is, wow, that was a hard class and I felt this, I felt that. That's something I think for teachers to really think about, is what is the off the mat experience? What are you trying to teach your students? So you and I are sitting here on bolsters and we're doing our best to engage our muscles to sit upright, right? So there's an off the mat experience that when we're sitting at home or sitting at work with good posture, what does that look like? And the hope is your teacher has been talking about that, engaging those rhomboids, squeezing those shoulder blades back and down in neutral, not as far back as we can go, sitting upright, but not having a straight spine, allowing some curve, having a softness while there's also an engagement, right? So meaning we can move, but we're also holding. So what is our off the mat experience? What are we working? If we're working hips, maybe it's ski season, right? You can always, for me, and this is maybe not for every yogi, but for me, yoga is one of the many experiences I allow my body to engage in, right? So I ski and I bike and I work out in the gym and I do core work. I also love to practice yoga. So for me, there's that piece. But for some people, yoga is everything. And sometimes that works, but sometimes maybe they're missing like a cardio experience, right? So for example, Iyengar is less cardio, right? And so, I mean, not that you're not breathing hard when you're holding,
You're
but
not going to do chaturanga stuff like that.
right. So I mean, we should maybe, for a full spectrum of health, we should look at what yoga provides. So many things, and also maybe what it doesn't as well. And so looking at that, another thing I like to talk about with students is, name some poses that stretch and open your quadriceps muscles.
Well, we've got our Warrior One position, which is the first back bend taught in the series of yoga.
Right.
And then in the vinyasa realm, we've got our crescent lunge, our lunge series.
But the lunge, so the back leg.
The back leg, right.
So when your leg is straight, you're not really stretching out the lower portion of the quadriceps. You're getting more of that upper portion, the rectus femoris, and the lower hip flexor muscles. There are a number of other muscles of the hip flexor.
Ustrasana?
So
camel?
I mean, there aren't many, right? Camel, yes.
That's one.
Especially in the lean back.
Right.
Maybe.
So back bends.
Well, with the knee the heel coming toward the rear. So like a king pigeon, if you reach back and pull something.
Right.
So there just aren't many. And so my point is, maybe you're the person who has really tight quads. And a yoga practice may not serve that stretching and that release as much as just doing something else, like getting on a foam roller or something.
Right.
And so I just like to point that out, not to poke holes in the yoga practice, but to look at the yoga practice as like this amazing experience. And there are so many others as well.
Right.
There's so many other things that we can do, or breaking the mold of what yoga, how you define yoga, and saying, well, yeah, I go to a class, but I also go home and I do these other things for my body. And for me, that is yoga. Like maybe for each of us, we define it differently.
Yeah.
Like you said, instead of having just a set of like, this is our guru, and this is how every position should look.
Right.
Breaking that mold and saying what serves our bodies the best.
It's I haven't spoken too much about this lately, but 5-6 years ago when I was in the yoga workshop and I was practicing Ashtanga yoga, there was a moment where I tore my shoulder labrum because I was doing chaturangas improperly for not just one time.
Yeah.
For multiple years,
hundreds
multiple
hundreds,
hours, 6 days a week, maybe 7.
Yeah.
And it was a long-term, slow train crash. But once the train crash hit, it went full speed. Yeah. And I couldn't do downward facing dog. I couldn't handstand. And I was in love with handstanding. Once I unlocked that muscular code, I was like, oh, God, it's the most enlivening thing to do a press-up handstand.
And all it takes is one, it could be a pinky, and you're like, I can't do my handstand.
I tore you maybe have to remind me the exact name, but FTCC band. It's a tiny little ligament right in here. And I tore that. I tore my shoulder labrum, and I was out of commission. And I fell out of love with yoga. It took me a while to fall back in love with yoga asana. And that's where I think my yoga teacher, Eddie Modestini and Kristen Bostiels, and they teach a form called yoga on the inside. Iyengar impacted and influenced highly, and being able to really pull myself back from, I want to go and do crown chas, and I want to put my foot behind my head. I want to do all these crazy things. And now I'm like, oh my God, Parsvottanasana, pyramid pose, extended side angle, these are my favorite poses.
Yeah. So,
foundational.
Well, exactly. So look at it from my world, right? So I'm doing my team and I, we're all doing, think of it as rehab. So anything that we can provide for you that will serve your body to make a positive change, right? Whether that's stretching or rolling or doing some kind of strengthening work. So when I look at yoga or yoga poses, if you go back to basic movements, and build that foundation from the basic movements and then extend from there, that is the safest way to do a practice. The reality is many of us, myself included, I show up, I'm physically able and fairly strong, so I can muscle my way through poses. And then I do them incorrectly, and I pattern that incorrect movement. And then when I do the next level harder class or movement, I think I can do it safely. And the reality is I'm not moving correctly at all. So I'm training improper balance, so imbalance in my body. It's like when you tore your shoulder, you were doing something incorrectly and you weren't given enough warning signs. You just didn't know.
I might have been given warning
Okay, you might have
signs,
been
and
given
my
some.
ego was too strong
Yeah.
because I was in second and third series.
Yeah,
It was like,
of
I got
course.
it.
I got
I got
this.
it.
I
I got
can do
it.
it.
I'm
Yeah.
fine. I'm 25. I'm invincible.
Right. And then,
I was definitely warned.
and then you're not.
And then I'm not.
You're like,
I'm like, oh my God, it was the most humbling experience.
maybe if I do it again, it'll be better. Like, yeah. So right. So first thing I would do with someone like you in that with your shoulder, I'd say, maybe right now doing chaturanga is not the best option for you. Can we find a practice for you that is less shoulder intensive, weight bearing shoulder intensive? And if you're able to just even lift arms overhead, if you can do that, let's start with that. If you can't, we'll break it down. So you break it down and then you build it back up slowly, right? Up into like, not that a down dog is like this very high level pose, but for someone with an injured shoulder,
It is.
It is. And so working that and then working that mobility and flexibility and strength, and then moving next phase into, there are a couple in between there, but into your handstand, right?
Yep.
Because once you have that mobility and that range of motion and you've done it long enough and you now have the strength, then you can start to bring different, as soon as you go from like a limb to the torso to the legs, think about how many moving, just joints.
Mechanics.
There's so many joints there that can be off. And so you break poses down into simplicity, 1 or 2 joint movements, and then adding slowly. And you don't add rotation with a fold, with all these things at once without first making sure you're trained for that. That's the way. That's the way I look at everything. I look at all my athletes, and I look at yoga as an athletic practice. It's a movement-based practice. So you need to be strong. It will give you strength, but just like any activity, runners, oh, you're a runner, you must have great knees. Like, no, I don't have great knees because I run, right? So there's this, because we're active, we sometimes wear down or break down our bodies. And other times it's a wonderful way to build them up.
Right.
So for me, the yoga practice is all about, it's not a competition. There's really no time constraint. Meaning you could move a little slower and it's okay. And you can choose not to do a pose. So it should be a very, very safe practice. And it oftentimes is, but it's not uncommon for me to, one of the first things I do when I teach these yoga trainings is people start coming up to me and asking me all these questions about, well, ever since I started this training, I'm doing so much more yoga and my body is not just sore, but beat up or affected negatively. And so they're like, I can't do this and I can't do that and I can't, because they've just ramped up too quickly. So finding a safe practice and finding ways to build it slowly.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. What would be some golden tips that you could offer to yoga teachers that seek to keep their students safe?
Well, first of all, learn anatomy, learn the joints. So when I don't know how much you recall of this, but when I teach the class, I very intentionally taught the bones first, looking at joints, looking at how they're put together. If you see a ball and socket joint, you know it's very mobile. If you see a hinge joint, it's mobile in one plane, but not in others. So understanding how the body's put together, and then what we ask of the body. So think about, what pose are you asking your students to do? Like, think about a sequence. What pose are you asking, even if it's 9? Okay, what is the goal with each of those? What are you trying to strengthen or open or release in the body? And then what are the challenges in each of those? So you have modifications ready to go. I think that that's probably the best advice I have, is to really understand the sequencing that you have and where the pitfalls might be and how you can immediately modify. And I know a lot of times as instructors, we can give, for those of you that are more advanced, do this. And if you're not as advanced, do this. But I would say more often than not, many of the students want to be in the advanced, especially in this area. Yeah. We want to think that we're stronger than we are.
Right.
And I've done that as well.
So I think that's a nice follow-up to this question. I mostly asked this question for my younger self who wanted to get to my next level. And I know for me, I had impatience to get there. What would be your insight for those who want to get to their next level and may be ready or may not be ready? Who knows?
Right.
But regardless, in light of, in slew of the yoga practice and, moving through the layers of our body, meaning maybe Urdhva Dhanurasana is full wheel. It's just so intense. Yeah. but we go through it. We move through that practice. And after a couple of weeks, maybe months, it becomes less intense. Yeah. You're able to be in the pose for 5 to 10 breaths. You've practiced. You've embodied this pose. What would you say for someone who wants to keep themselves safe and wants to get to the next level? Yeah. What are the points of mindfulness that we ought to hold for our own internal journey?
I think part of it is, first and foremost, let go of ego. I mean, there's so much about, can you do wheel? Because I can do full wheel. Like I did full, like we're proud of ourselves. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but if we set the expectation, like for example, I'll say this sometimes when people are coming into my practice, I'll say, the goal is to eventually get to, let's say, holding a plank to 90 seconds or, 2 minutes, right? But for you, I want you to hold it for 10 or 15. And they kind of look at me and I say, just for now. The goal today is 10 or 15 seconds. Yes. I want you to do it properly, and I want you to do that for a week. And I'll see you next week, and I'll see how you're doing. If you're doing well, we'll have you go to like 20 or 30. And over the course of a month, they'll have built up. So the same thing with the practice. If you're practicing, let's use the wheel example. What are some poses that you can do to help with wheel? So how flexible, for example, are you through your shoulders? So maybe doing some, even a down dog in a child's pose.
Yes.
Working the shoulder range of motion. And you know this from handstands as well. Really making sure you have that full range of motion. Okay, then you can start to work the strength. Hold your poses longer. So you break down, are you less flexible or are you, a little weaker? And sometimes there's obviously a combination of the two. So working poses to make yourself, if you need the flexibility, more flexible. If you're hypermobile, you probably don't need that at all. So it's all about strength. So working one joint at a time, strengthening shoulders, strengthening, a back bend. So any back bend you can have and hold, maybe a standing back bend where you're when I say back bend, how far back did you picture I was having someone go? A standing?
Probably just like a hands on hips standing, little gentle arch of the chest and shoulder squeeze.
The number of times I'll bring a student up in a class and say, can you demonstrate, a back bend, a standing back? And they hear, you want my hands on the floor behind me. And I was like, I didn't say that.
10 years ago, I would have done that.
Yeah. I thought about making this shirt that said, not as far as you can. And so I'd say, hey, Alec, show me a back bend, but don't go as far as you can. Yeah. Because we all hear that. And so to keep ourselves safer, like let's continue to play on this wheel pose. You don't just go and try wheel. I mean, sure, for fun, whatever we're going to call it, if you do one and you do it, with some mindfulness, it's okay. But working really systematically to see where you limited, how can you access more range of motion or more strength through other poses to build up to these larger poses. And then don't hold it every time as long as you can. Right. In the beginning. Right. Once you're trained for it, you can go much longer. It's just like plank. You don't jump into a plank and say, hold it for 2 minutes.
Oh, God.
Who can do it, right? And so if you can muscle your way through it and cheat your way through it, you're not really accessing the pose in the way it's supposed to be. So my suggestion is to find other poses to allow you to build and find your limitations and work those limitations. Just like anything, if you know that you're limited with the shoulder movement, work that particular range and then bring it back in. So what I would do in my practice is I might say, Alec, how are you, why aren't you capable of getting into that pose? Where do you feel it? What are your limitations? Oh, my lower back it just pinches a little bit. Well, let's do some work in the lower back. Let me look at a couple poses and maybe show you some other things you can do before going back into wheel. So we break it down and then we build it back up. It all becomes, for me, it's all very logical.
Right.
It's like,
yes, very much
make it simple, but our egos get in the way.
Yeah,
but I did full wheel the other day. Yeah, but you told me your back hurt. Yeah, but I could do it. Yeah, but
just because you can doesn't mean you should.
There's my other shirt. It's just because you can doesn't mean you should.
There's my other shirt.
Because people think, well, I can. I've done chaturanga for years and years, and just because you can do it doesn't mean your shoulder likes it. You're like, oh, but I don't know why I got injured. All of a sudden it started hurting. I've been doing it this way for years. Well, that's why it's hurting.
Why?
It's like bringing logic back into it. So if you let go of ego and look at just building things systematically, and sometimes that means breaking them down. You climb as well.
Not really,
Okay,
but I can.
So climbers in the gym and movement, for example.
Yeah.
If they're always trying the same thing over and over and they're failing, one argument would be, oh, keep working at it. Another would be like, try a different route or try a different movement or try like instead
different
of
hand placement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so just shift it a little bit or go down to something simpler or work, let's say it's footwork or something. Work your feet on these particular these segments of these rocks, these routes, and then bring it back into something harder. So I remember I did that once. There was a very small handhold wall, and I went and I worked in a safe place because I didn't want to fall off the big wall, in a safe way to work my hands. And so the same thing with the yoga practice, with basically any movement or any activity. Break it down, make it more simple, and then build it back up.
And you know what you were saying, just like in light of when you offer a student, like, show me a back bend, they just go for it. It is so mirrored to our society.
Yeah.
Our society is harder, faster, better, stronger. Yeah. Go. Yeah. You know,
what's the speedometer in your car say? Like 160? Like, why? Yeah. Right? Oh, because I could, if I wanted to, I could go that fast. And like we think that with our bodies too. Like
it really is up to like 160. Yeah, it's hilarious. Like,
never come close to
that. Yeah.
So like, oh, but our bodies. I got a 220. What do you got on yours? Because I could do. I'll show you a 220. I might tear a hamstring, but I can do that. We all think. And that's what I mean about letting go of ego. And I'm not on some pedestal saying I'm like
egoless.
I'm not, totally have run into my own challenges,
yes.
And I'm constantly relearning this. But as a teacher, I try to let go of that and take my lessons and pass them on. But the biggest thing for me is having students really understanding the practice. You know, for me in Ashtanga practice it was more the meditative experience that I personally didn't get as much from an Iyengar practice. But for me as a medical practitioner, the Iyengar style seemed better suited for a lot of my patients and clients because it was a safer, slower movement. So you can look at the benefits of each, and I know we're just talking about two different ones, but there are a lot of different styles of yoga and a lot of different teachers who kind of break the mold of what style they have. And finding what suits you and suits your body, I think, is so valuable. That becomes truly introspective. Yeah. Instead of just, I showed up, I checked it off the box, I got it in, and now I'm going to go back to my life, my busy, crazy life. It's about really trying to embody those experiences of whatever you're doing, whether it's a yoga practice or whatever you're doing, to fulfill this inner power that we all have and that we want to cultivate so we can see how far we can go.
I feel that it becomes a tool for self-reliant healing. Yeah. Something that we discover within what's working, and we get to call upon that where, for me as a snowboarder, when I snowboard, it just royally screws my SI up. I mean, it just, oh God, it's awful. And the next day sucks. However, I know 4 specific poses in a specific set sequence that really helps my lower back not have pain the next day after I ride. Right. And that is exactly the key of it being a tool for self-reliant healing. Right. So I love it. I think this is an awesome, insightful conversation that I find that students and teachers both are able to find connection to. And I wonder for you, where do you see the realm and the world of yoga going right now?
Ooh, interesting question.
Because I'll share real quick because it's funny because a couple years ago, it must have been at least 7, maybe 6 years ago. I interviewed Mary Taylor and Richard Freeman, and just as I ask you that question now, it reminds me I ought to go back to that interview and hear what they said, because 5 years ago then is different than now, and where will we be 5 years from now? I wonder what does your mind see?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because back, especially 20 years ago. Think about how few yoga studios were around. I was looking at opening a fairly large studio in Boulder that was very visible because I really believed in, having a combined practice, and there weren't many yoga studios in town. Now think about how many there are, right? And
every street.
Every street.
Almost.
I mean, there's so many.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, yoga is much more accessible to the masses. It's no longer this, what do you do? What is it called? I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find too many people that just don't know what yoga is. They may not fully understand it, but they at least understand what it is. Yeah. So where is it going? It's just exploded, right? my hope is where it's going is that there becomes more depth in the education. But I think the reality of how our society is where it's going is, people open practices to make money. I mean, fair enough. They need to stay viable.
Got to put food on the table.
And if they can't pay their rent, they're going to close. So the model has become, you look at some of these bigger chains, a lot of them have been bought by investors, and a lot of them are about churning out as many students as they can, having a lot of programs, which again has more access, but sometimes it waters down the experience. How many trainings have you done?
10.
I don't think the way of yoga is going into 10 trainings.
Yeah.
I don't think the average teacher is willing to put that much time and energy into
money
into a practice to teach. Right now, one class a week. I mean, you're doing so much more with yoga. But my point is having those, the people who are really truly loving what they're teaching and just learning more and more and sharing it. I don't think that's the way yoga is going. I think the way it's going is how inexpensively can we knock out a teacher training program? How many students can we get out and then bring back in to teach? And how can we put many, many of these studios around different cities? And again, there are benefits to that as well. I don't want to only talk to the negative, because that is what allows. I mean, I found Richard Freeman's class, and he was one of the very few and the very probably best in town at that time.
Yeah.
Now there are so many other options. And so there are benefits in that, and there are challenges. And I think the way that yoga is moving is the way it's gone, is more and more studios, younger teachers with less education.
Right. I think it's a really powerful question and a wonderful insight that is really grounded. I mean, even 5 years ago, I couldn't have ever imagined that the social media wave had taken off so much with yoga on it as it is now. So I like that. I think that it is important to be able to see how, in hopes that the yoga becomes more in depth. Yeah. And it can go, I think it should go as wide as possible, reach as many people as possible, and also don't forget to go deep. And to be able to self-inquire, right?
Yeah, I would love to think that that's where it's going.
Yeah.
Where, very high level, well, I don't know of a number of high level teachers anymore that are teaching programs. So there are, but anymore it's like, if someone wants to take a class, it's so easy. You can go online and take them now. You can't always get a license in your state, but you can take an online only class. You can do these in-person classes that are partially in person and partially not. The teachers change. Some of them are, many levels down from whoever started the program. And some of them are just, I just graduated and now I'm teaching you. Because that's what they can afford to do.
I love it.
So that could be challenging.
Yeah.
So
this has been an amazing conversation. And I wonder for you, last question that we always like to ask is, what is a golden nugget that you would like to offer to the listeners, whether they're teachers or students or just human beings on the journey of...
Okay, so with that question, a little different. I was going to go a different route, but with that question, I think finding ways to assimilate information, whether it's, being in I was listening to a political podcast on the way down, being open-minded to hearing other people's views and opinions and understanding where they're coming from, whether it's looking at we've been talking about Ashtanga versus Iyengar, and what are the benefits of each? What are the challenges of each? What are they missing or what are they providing? And so I found that with my own practice is finding a lineage and only staying true only to that lineage without recognizing that there are benefits outside of that. I think, throughout life is just a way to stay open-minded and humble, and also allow yourself to be accepting of information so that you can embody it and then put it back into the universe, so to speak. So for me, that has become a big part of how I've learned and how in my practice I get results, is looking at each of us as individuals, having a body of knowledge over here, a slightly different body of knowledge over here, and then combining that into a unique experience. So holding that knowledge and being open-minded, I think, is this pearl that if we all did that, we'd all be much happier people and much more accepting.
I feel that. To be open-minded. That's a beautiful golden nugget to walk through as the journey of the yogi, the student, the teacher. Always. Well, Dave, it's amazing to connect with you in person, which is such a gift.
It's so nice to run into you.
So grateful. Yeah. And how can people find you if they want to learn more from you, study from you?
My company is called Boulder Therapeutics. We've been practicing yoga and we've been practicing, we do practice yoga, but we've been practicing massage therapy and acupuncture since '99 in town. We've got a clinic in Boulder and one in Superior. And we focus on injuries and athletes, so bouldertherapeutics.com. And my phone number is 303-444-1171 if you need to call. So there you
awesome,
go.
Man. Well,
thanks, I appreciate the shout out.
Absolutely. Well, so much love to you, Dave. And thank you, Yoga Revealers, for tuning in. If you found value from this conversation, please do share it on social media, send it to someone who's maybe had an injury before or practices yoga and you want to see that they continue to take care of themselves. And from our hearts to yours, namaste.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Yoga Revealers, for tuning in and checking in. This is Alec, Vishal, Rouben, and Andrew Seven Seeley, and we are so grateful for the work that you are doing in the world to progress further forward in our practices and our offerings in life. We have gotten such great feedback on the 7-Day Yoga Reset, and we are so pumped to release to you the 100 Days of Yoga program. This is a practice at your own pace with pranayama breathwork, asana practice that are great for beginners, intermediate, and teachers alike, with lectures and visualizations and meditations. So stay tuned and get into the 7-Day Yoga Reset. Put $1 in, put $7 in, put $77 in, whatever works for you. And if you found value from this episode with my brother Dave, please check out his Instagram at Boulder Therapeutics. And you know where to find me, Alec Love Life Yoga. Thank you for tuning in with us today, and may your day be filled with peace, practice, and deep, deep breaths. Keep going. You make a difference every day, especially when you practice. My friends, I love you, love life, and I'll see you next time. Namaste.